So I'm delighted to be here on behalf of my two co-authors, Sekou and Jeremiah. I'm partly because I really believe we have something to say as professors to contribute to the debate and discussion on many sensitive and important issues in the area. Let me just sort of explain who we are. I'm an accounting professor, and Jeremiah Green, one of my co-authors, is also an accounting professor. He's at Texas A&M. I'm at UNC Chapel Hill, the business school, the Keenan Flagler Business School. Sekou Bermis is one of my strategy colleagues. He's in strategy, not accounting, so he gets a thumbs up for not being an accounting professor. But we've been working together for the last 4+ years on a variety of topics that we feel are important, and we can contribute, we hope, to again, important questions and debates. Let me explain very briefly what business school professors do. We have 3 responsibilities. We teach, we research, and we do a little bit of administration, hopefully only a little bit. On the research side, that's what we're going to be focusing on today, if I may. And the way that we do our research as business professors is mainly on what's called the positive side of the coin. Let me first of all go, and I'm going to share my screen, if I may, to my slide deck and go through that if I can with you. I'm going to talk in terms of research about what I'm referring to here as the positive economics analyses of a variety of business issues relating to diversity. And the way that business school professors are trained and we do our research is what's called positively rather than normatively. So normatively, we might do a little bit of that, maybe 5% of our work would be normative. Normative is where you're bringing in your personal values or societal values about something or opinions about something, whereas most of our research is positive in the sense of technically the word means bringing in data, objective theory, but particularly data-based analyses that can help us, we hope, objectively look at answers to key questions. So you'll see here on the slide, Sekou, Jeremiah, and myself, and what I'm going to do is to go through a few of our papers very quickly to give you an idea of the questions we've been looking at and some of the answers that we think we've arrived at. Hopefully, again, desire to contribute positively into the conversation. So the first study, which is perhaps the one that Paolo mentioned he had noticed, is one that we did back in 2021, really, looking at McKinsey. The paper we wrote is called McKinsey's Diversity Matters / Delivers / Wins Results Revisited. And that was starting off with Jeremiah and myself before Sekou joined us as a co-author. And the background here is that McKinsey at the time were arguing very strongly for BC for the business case for diversity. And essentially what happened was McKinsey in a series of studies reported finding this statistically significant positive relation between industry adjusted sort of profitability measures, EBIT margins of big global sets of large public companies and the racial or ethnic diversity of their executives. And in fact, one of the key authors on the McKinsey studies went so far as to make the causal statement that their data, McKinsey's data, showed that more diverse leadership teams are more successful. And therefore, the recommendation or the urging from McKinsey was pursuing diversity, particularly at the senior levels, is a business imperative because essentially it's driving better results. And here's a little picture of what they were arguing, namely that higher diversity, so higher diversity in executives will be the right-hand side bars, the light bars here, are associated with much better firm performance than the darker blue bars on the left. Now, what we did is we decided to examine their study because it was such a big set of results. What we did was critique it in 2 ways. First of all, we gathered a more representative, we thought, data set of firms. We used the Standard & Poor's 500 companies. So you're probably familiar with, maybe from an investing point of view, the S&P 500, US publicly traded companies, a very wide set of companies here in the US. And we gathered data on their executives as of the middle of 2020, and coded up their race and ethnicity and gender, but particularly focusing on race and ethnicity. Then, having gathered that data independently of this big set of US companies that are publicly traded, we then went on and compared their financial performance in that particular year. And what we found was, yes, there's a little bit of a difference between the very most diverse, based on McKinsey's diversity metric, firms and the least diverse, but it's really not a big enough difference to be what we call statistically significant. And that is not different from what you might expect to see just by chance. A little picture that shows what we have in the graphic in our paper is the vertical axis is how much the outperformance of a particular company in the middle, so in 2020 in the S&P 500 was, and then on the horizontal axis the extent of the diversity in their executive team. And that basically the little straight line through here is indicating there really isn't much of a statistical relationship. The other thing to note about McKinsey is that their study was essentially putting the causality backwards. They measured firm performance and then at the end of the period, then measured executive racial and ethnic diversity. But that's sort of the wrong way round, because you want to measure the diversity first, then see how it affects going forward the financial performance of the firm. And that's what led to our second study, where we were delighted to join in with Sekou to essentially look at, quote, the McKinsey argument, not just one particular year, but a series of years, and doing the causality the right way. Establish diversity, then look at performance going forward in time. I've got the words here, but the key thing I'm going to put, I'm going to just sort of describe it in words quickly. We looked at data in 2011, 2014, 2017, 2020, 2021, so 5 years, not just one. And what we found is across a wide variety of metrics for measuring racial and ethnic diversity in executives, nothing was different in terms of those firms' financial performance with high versus low amounts of executive diversity. Nothing was different from what you might expect to see just by chance. So our conclusion in these first two studies was it doesn't appear that the McKinsey argument holds water when you take it as objectively as we tried to be to the actual data for US companies, big US companies, 500 of them that are publicly traded here in the US. The next study was shifting gears for us and looking at an argument that had been made that there are a number of biases potentially in how firms hire or promote within the organizations over wide periods of time to get to the executive level. And so this was another paper we did. And what we essentially did in this paper, and again, sorry for all the words here, but I'll explain it in language. What we did was to recognize that on the one hand, relative to the US population densities of blacks, Asians, whites, and Hispanics, it is the case that, let's say, minority executives are underrepresented relative to the US population. However, in terms of looking to see, is that because of discrimination by firms while the people are going up the food chain, so to speak, within a company to be an executive, is that because of bias there or not? We thought that maybe better than the benchmark of the US population may not be the best benchmark. Maybe the best benchmark in terms of establishing discrimination by firms within the organization is the racial and ethnic densities of the college cohorts from which the executives came. So in other words, it might be that, for example, blacks are way underrepresented relative to the US population today, but what was the density of blacks in the cohorts of people graduating from US colleges and universities 30, 35 years ago when they were hired into the firms themselves? And what we found is that relatively, when you do that contrast, it turns out that, forget the picture in the top left, that shouldn't be there. The left-hand side is basically saying lots of differences when you benchmark against the US population, but when you benchmark against the densities of cohorts when the executive actually came in, much, much less of a difference. The takeaway being that one has to be careful potentially in claiming or arguing for bias against or for a particular group, thinking about the cohort analysis in this particular situation. One quick study we did was to look at stock price reactions to the announcement of black top executive appointments, partly because there had been some studies that, one study that argued, hey, we find a big positive reaction on average. Another study found we find a big negative reaction on average. And so we decided, hey, let's do a fresh look at this. And what we found was, yeah, maybe there's a bit of a positive reaction, but the median reaction when firms announce they have a black top executive appointment being made, the median reaction tends to be basically nothing, about zero, as one might expect potentially from an economics point of view, in that firms, you could argue, are going to hire the best person they can, no matter what their race or ethnicity. And then the last study I'll quickly touch on, and I'm thinking I'm just about out of time, so I'm going to spend a minute or two on this, is a very recent one we've been working on, which is looking at what firms show. And again, we're going to look at the S&P 500 firms here. What do firms show on their corporate websites with regard to the visual aspect of race and ethnicity and gender representation? So what we did here was we collected data on S&P 500 firms' websites just prior to George Floyd, after George Floyd, and then in Q2 of this year, post President Trump's beginning of his second presidency. So we've got 3 points in time: pre-George Floyd, post-George Floyd, post-President Trump II. And we focus in the paper mainly on the visual representations, the densities of blacks, Asians, whites, and Hispanics on the DEI page, but we also look at the About Us and the home pages. And visually what we find is pictured in this graph here. On the left here we have Asian, here we have black, here we have Hispanic, and here we have white. The bottom line being that we do find that blacks are overrepresented relative to the US population here, and we argue the US population is the best benchmark because firms are looking at the overall population when they're putting information up onto their DEI page. Blacks are overrepresented and Hispanics are underrepresented. That's, I think, sort of a claim that would be borne out and verified by our data analysis here. We also find that Asians are overrepresented relative to the US population and whites are substantially underrepresented. So that's sort of what we find, and we suggest in a very preliminary way that probably what may be going on for the overrepresentation of blacks and the underrepresentation of whites has to do with the social pressures associated with George Floyd, and potentially the overrepresentation of Asians and the underrepresentation of Hispanics may have to do more with firms looking to pitch their companies in terms of hiring in new talent toward Asians who historically have had higher sort of GPA scores, etc., coming out of college. So thank you for bearing with me on that. I will stop at this point and turn it over to any questions or comments.